Sometimes I'm asked the question, why stigma? Why this area? Why am I interested in this area? And I'll give you the answer because I think it's important in a couple respects. One is about 5 years ago, I attended a workshop by Dr. Lori Rugel, an expert in our field. And Dr. Rugel talked about the importance of language of recovery and also stigma with respect to clients in our field. That really opened up my eyes. It really taught me a lot, and it really helped me realize that this is a very important area. And the second reason I became interested in stigma was I worked at the Council on Compulsive Gambling of New Jersey for 6 years. And while I was there, part of my job was to take the helpline calls, the 1-800-GAMBLER calls. And I'll tell you that I learned so much. I was one of the biggest takeaways of that job for me. And I learned about the level of stigma that's often present in callers. And not just the problem gamblers who might be calling in, but also the family members. It really opened up my eyes to this area because oftentimes when a person called in, they would express some type of shame, some type of stigma. Or if they didn't directly express it, there'd be an undercurrent of that in their voice. And we'd talk about that. And sometimes they didn't call that number because they were afraid of being judged. And we'll talk more about that later. But again, I'm fortunate that I had those experiences. And I'm also fortunate, and I have to acknowledge the support and encouragement and advocacy of two people from the New York Council on Problem Gambling, those being Steve and Gloria Block. These two individuals have encouraged me along the way and have been strong advocates in this area in terms of creating a greater awareness regarding the importance of language of recovery. So let's jump into our objectives. And we're a lot of heavy lifting here, but we're going to be okay. We're going to get through it all. Develop a greater understanding of the powerful nature of stigma. And let me tell you, it is powerful. Define stigma and examine its importance and impact on problem disorder gambling clients. Develop a greater understanding of inadvertent stigmatizing language. And also learn ways of combating problem disorder gambling stigma through stigma reduction initiatives, and learn how to destigmatize your workplace. Okay, quickly, ground rules. Participation is encouraged. Yeah, as Colleen said earlier, please enter anything you like in the chat box that's, you feel questions, comments, anything. I really believe we learn from each other in webinars and things like this. So again, don't hesitate. That will help me in the future for presentations. Respect for others goes without saying. It's okay to disagree, but it's not okay to be disagreeable. And also, it's okay to leave and return should any material make you feel uncomfortable. Okay, stigma. What is stigma? Well, it's a mark of disgrace that sets a person or a group apart. Social groups are devalued, rejected, and excluded on the basis of socially discredited health conditions. Okay, and I ask you that you mentally footnote that one that I just read regarding social groups, because we're going to come back to that later in the presentation. Most experts agree the biggest barrier to addiction treatment faced by clients is stigma. The biggest barrier to getting into treatment. Many people living with addiction and or mental health disorders say the stigma they face is worse than the illness itself. Think about that. The stigma is worse than the illness. The individual carries shame, feeling like a failure. Family members are also stigmatized, and we don't want to lose sight of that. Oftentimes, family members, loved ones are greatly stigmatized. Okay, let's look at the problem. Problem gambling continues to be misunderstood and also stigmatized. Well, 74% believe that gambling problems are caused by lack of willpower. Imagine that. So many people believe this is about not having enough willpower. And that comes from the National Council on Problem Gambling's Engage survey done last year. 1 in 4 Americans believe that those with a gambling problem are unlikely to recover. Another 1 in 3 are not sure. That doesn't sound very encouraging. It's generally believed female problem gamblers feel much more stigma than male problem gamblers. That's generally believed. And if you're working with female problem gamblers, be interesting if you want to make a comment in a chat box regarding that, but that seems to be the consensus in the field. Okay, some fallacies of disordered gambling, substance use, and or mental health disorders. Okay, what are the fallacies? Well, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but let's go through them. Disordered gambling is a choice, not an illness. Disordered gambling reflects lack of willpower or is a weakness. Substance use disorder is a choice, not an illness. Individuals with mental illness somehow cause their illness and can stop at any time or just snap out of it. That was a term that was used years ago where, somebody would say, just snap out of it, like the person could just snap out of it, not realizing the person might have been suffering from severe depression or some type of mental illness. Falsehoods and ignorance, for example, mental illness and violence go hand in hand. Well, sometimes they may, but on the other side, in a fair amount of cases, they don't go hand in hand. Stigma is the missing piece in our nation's response to the addiction crisis. It truly is. And as we go through the PowerPoint today and in our webinar, I think you'll be able to better realize how important stigma is. It's no joke, gambling addiction. It's no joke at all. Sometimes when I used to do a health fair and we had the council or New Jersey Council's table at a health fair, some type of event, and sometimes an individual or two might come up and kind of crack a joke and say, you got a deck of cards back there? And they kind of smiled and I felt for him because I think deep down inside, there's something going on there that really needed attention. And some people see it as a joke. Some people see degenerate gamblers as people who are laughed at and scorned and stigmatized. And we'll get to that, some of the terms a little later in the presentation. Okay, well, here's what gambling addiction does to society. And these are statistics from the National Council on Problem Gambling. $7 billion annually. The cost from bankruptcy, divorce, job loss, healthcare, criminal justice issues, primarily due to stigma. Less than 8% of individuals with gambling disorder will ever seek treatment. Less than 8%. So out of 100 problem gamblers out there, less than 8 will come in to the doors of your treatment center. That's staggering. That's really, to me, it's a number that we really have to improve upon. Mental health, substance use disorder facts. Cost of substance abuse use disorder is greater than $820 billion a year and growing. This is on the substance use disorder side. And again, the thrust of this is, if stigma is permitted, it will prevail at continued expenses of our communities. And a quote from Bill Clinton, mental illness is nothing to be ashamed of, but stigma and bias shame us all. Okay, mental health stigma. Let's take a closer look at it. A belief that revealing a criminal record to an employer is less deleterious than revealing a mental illness. That's amazing. But a person is not so apt to reveal that they might be treated for a mental illness, and they'd rather talk about or reveal some of the time they might have done for criminal activity. Some people with mental illness are most creative and imaginative, and we could go back to Lincoln, who experienced severe depression, and Churchill, I believe, experienced bipolar. And if we want to go more recent, we could look at one of the Philadelphia Eagles football players, a star, Brian Dawkins. who for many years suffered from severe depression and other issues, but was able to combat them, and also stressed to athletes, professional athletes, the importance of talking about mental illness that might be affecting them. Shame. Okay, well, stigma brings upon shame. As defined by Brene Brown, I'm sure you're familiar with Brene, University of Houston, researcher there. Shame is an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Okay, so it's on another level. Sometimes people might think that stigma has something to do with maybe a level of embarrassment. Well, it really goes much, much deeper than a level of embarrassment. It really goes, the powerful nature of addiction and gambling addiction, and tied together with stigma, goes on another level, much more so than just being embarrassed. Okay, what types of stigma might there be? Well, there's internal, and that's individuals feeling shame and negative thoughts about their membership in a particular stigmatized group, and also people who may avoid seeking help, fearful others will judge them. And again, taking calls at the council, sometimes I would gently ask, you've been, how long have you been in crisis maybe? And the person would say, well, how long? And I'd say, did you ever think of calling before? And a fair number of times they'd say, yeah, I did, but I was afraid to pick up the phone. And it takes a lot for a person to pick up a phone and make a call. The first step is usually the hardest. And the person might also add, and I didn't want to be judged. So, that fear, that internal self-stigma is oftentimes present. External, enacted stigma, the experiences of how we stigmatize others, judging, okay, judging them, making them feel less than human, okay? So stigma from the recovering community. This is another area that's really bigger than I initially ever thought. Recovering people stigmatize one another, and they do. And here are some examples. For the problem gambler, I only play scratch-offs and do not go to the casino. Okay, so they're kind of minimizing their involvement with scratch-offs. They're not a high roller, so they're not that bad. I never could kind of figure out what that bad meant, but I only drink beer, okay, on the alcohol side. I don't drink the hard stuff. I only drink beer, so I don't have to worry as much. And then I'll share quickly a story when, again, one of the calls I took at the council, a person called in looking for a GA meeting in a particular area of New Jersey, and I found the meeting for them really close to where they lived. And it happened to be at a hospital that had a behavioral health program. And the caller said to me, and I'm paraphrasing, but the caller said to me, oh, that's where those people go. And I immediately knew what he was saying. And he did not, again, he did not want to go to the hospital, apparently fearful that, he might be seen as a behavioral health client, or he might be amongst those clients. Clearly, he was stigmatizing a person with a problem gambling issue, was stigmatizing people with mental health issues who are going for help. So stigma takes on all types of forms, and unfortunately is present in many ways. Okay, so addict. This is a term that's, again, it's been used a long time and probably will be used for a long time, because this language of recovery is really evolutionary. And as we go through this, you'll have a sense of, where it was and where it's come to. So individuals who have an addiction and a mental health disorder, or those in recovery, choose to identify themselves. That's not for us. It's not our call. It's for individuals to make that call. For many people in early recovery, though, the term addict is a helpful way of identifying symptoms and issues and finding a way to connect and bond in a healthy way that promotes change. Okay, people in early recovery. However, the addict label suggests that the whole person is the problem, rather than the problem being the problem. Okay, a big difference there. Okay, recovery, and this is a bit long, but I think it's real important. Recovery is a paradox. During treatment and early phases of recovery, saying the words, I am an addict, is a powerful way to help people understand that their lives have become unmanageable and that they need help. However, during later phases of recovery, the same phrase can prompt some people to define themselves solely by their addiction. The challenge for addicted people, their families, and those who treat them is to recognize that while self-identifying as an addicted person can be liberating, viewing oneself only as an addicted person can be self-limiting. Richard Landis from his program in Maryland. I think that quote came from maybe 2014. I think Richard was pretty far ahead in his thinking. Okay, we have to respect cultural differences, and here's why I say that. Cultural differences can affect language of recovery. Some individuals in recovery, depending on their environments, they may choose to call themselves as a clean and sober addict as a badge of honor. And they wear that badge of honor in their recovery. And we respect that because, as I said in a few screens prior, it's not our call as to how an individual may wish to call themselves. And cultural differences certainly play a big part in this. Okay, I want to show a clip of William White, a person in recovery, and I believe this is a pretty powerful clip that has to do with stigma, has to do with recovery messaging, and I won't tell you the rest because I want you to be surprised with it. And then we'll talk a little bit about it if we could. So let's see. Hopefully the audio comes through for everyone. Let's give it a try.
Most everyone in America knows someone in recovery. The problem historically is they didn't know they were in recovery, which means they could continue to maintain incredible stereotypes about who are the people who develop alcohol and other drug problems in this country and who are the people who recover and don't recover. There are a lot of issues around stigma that I can't educate you out of. I can give you all the facts. I can read all the books to you. I can show you documentaries. And nothing's going to change that embedded prejudice until you encounter personally someone in recovery who means something to you and hear their story. I'm one of the most out people probably in this country. And I can run around with my big Recovery March t-shirt, right? And I get home from a march and my dear wife Rita says, can you run to the store for me? And I say, sure. And without thinking, now this is decades now, I pull my recovery t-shirt off and throw a sloppy old plain t-shirt on, and I'm about to walk out the door, and all of a sudden it hits me. What the, I won't say the word, what did I just do? And all of a sudden you realize this stuff is insidious. You know, that it just keeps creeping back in. That I'm okay as a person in recovery when I'm surrounded by 15,000 people in recovery. But I'm a bit embarrassed to walk down the aisles of my local grocery store with the Recovery Celebration t-shirt on. That's how insidious some of this stuff gets to be. Obviously, the call to action we are making is not for everyone in recovery to go public with their recovery status. Stigma related to alcohol and other drug problems is still very real in this country, and people can experience significant consequences by disclosing parts of their addiction and even their recovery status. So what we are looking for is a vanguard of people in recovery who are temperamentally suited for that role and whose personal and family circumstances allow them to take on part of that public role, to simply step forward and put a face and voice on recovery. And as soon as we begin to get this vanguard to step forward, those stereotypes simply can't be sustained any longer. And as the stereotypes begin to disintegrate from this advocacy effort, then what we can do is come behind that with our advocacy and begin to dismantle the discriminatory structures that really have created obstacles for people seeking and maintaining recovery over time, and building resources that are going to dramatically widen the doorway of entry into long-term recovery for people. We could barely fill a shelf in our addiction studies libraries with what we know about the recovery experience, but we can fill whole buildings about what we know about the pathology of addiction. We have millions of people in long-term recovery in the United States. It's time we began to study the solution to this problem as opposed to study the problem. I was going to Dallas, Texas. I was going to speak at a professional conference, and I visited one of the old timers in the recovery community in Dallas, Texas, CW, and I was interviewing him about the early history of treatment in the Southwest. And I'll never forget, Circe, when we took a break in the interview, Circe said, "Now, Bill, what's this research stuff you do?" And I explained to him that what I did for a living was I worked in a research institute, and we studied treatment by doing treatment outcome studies. And I told him we were going to follow people for 5 years. Now, I'm talking to someone with 54 years of sobriety at this point in time. And Circe just looked at me and smiled and said, 5 years, very impressive. He said, "What does your research tell you about people like me?" And what do you think I had to say to him? "We don't even know you exist. We don't know anything about people in long-term recovery." On the plane home from Dallas that night, I had this powerful experience. And it was this awakening that I had spent almost my whole life learning about addiction. And I felt like I knew a lot about addiction. I'd mastered a fair amount of that knowledge. And I'd learned a lot about treatment. But separate from my own experience, from the standpoint of science, I knew very little about the long-term processes of recovery. And so I sort of made this promise to myself that for whatever time I had left in my career, I was going to devote it to the study of the solution. My entire presentation reflects, I hope, a sense that we are on the brink of moving from a pathology paradigm and a treatment paradigm as the center of the field to a paradigm of recovery. What some of you don't know in this room is that some of you will go on in the city of Boston, in the state of Massachusetts, and nationally to help lead this movement. And for those of you in this room, I wish each of you, and particularly those of you who may not know it, but your destiny is tied up with this larger movement that is now unfolding. I wish all of you Godspeed on your journey into this recovery frontier.
Okay. Thoughts, comments, anyone? Colleen, anything in the chat box right now as to William White's presentation?
Someone just posted, one of the best things professionals can do for those in recovery is respecting and meeting individuals where they're at. Recovery is different for everyone. No journeys are the same, even if they appear similar. When we can accept people where they are and not judge them, success for them is more attainable.
Yes, really important. Good comment. Good comment. Meeting the person where they're at. Yes,
Yep.
Thank you.
We also
Yes.
had someone say, what is our definition of recovery? What about those who harm reduction but gain their lives back?
Well, harm reduction, again, one of the models of treatment and oftentimes used in the field, and a valuable tool, I believe, that, that can help a person in, stay within their boundaries and be able to, to be able to not go down that dark road again. Again, that's debatable, that some therapists believe, and of course, GA would say, total abstinence, but I believe there's a good place for harm reduction in our field. Any others, Colleen? Any other thoughts? Anything on William White and his presentation in terms of how he didn't want to put that shirt on to go to the grocery store for his wife, and how he held back, even though he has many years of abstinence, sobriety. Any thoughts on that? Is that a common thread, do you believe, amongst us?
Someone else said the t-shirt "Stigma is so common, it's so sad. We must change how society sees people in recovery." Someone else said William's White call for people who are able to step up as a person in recovery is beautiful. The Me Too factor has healed so many of my clients. And someone else said, I'm so honored to be in this field at the time of Mr. White.
Very good. All good comments. Thank you. Thank you. and sharing our stories, as William White does in recovery messaging, something that, Colleen, you had a presentation done by Jonathan and Ashley a couple of weeks ago, and sharing our stories and the power of that, and how we can spread the word in a positive way. And we'll come back to that a little later in our presentation because it kind of ties together, but really good comments. I appreciate what everyone has commented on and your interest in and insights into some of the issues we're talking about today. Okay, so let's talk about stigma a little deeper. And much public stigma exists regarding problem disordered gambling. It's really so stigmatized. Stereotypes, problem disordered gamblers are often seen as irresponsible, impulsive, selfish, corrupt, stupid. I could probably come up with another half dozen descriptions here, but you get the message. You understand how they're stereotyped. Expressions of individuals experiencing gambling addiction or self-stigma is very debilitating on an individual's help-seeking behavior and recovery. Of course, they're reluctant to come into treatment. They're afraid, okay? And the words, it's so much about the words. They discriminate, they discourage, they exclude, they isolate, they misinform, and of course they shame. So words have power, and we'll jump into that real soon. Stigma generated by and perpetrated by prejudicial attitudes and beliefs. And let me tell you, we all do have some level of attitudes and beliefs. I think Father Martin, in one of his videos back in the day, I'm dating myself, but I think Father Martin, the alcoholism recovering priest from many years ago, Chalk Talk and Guidelines. I think one of his sayings was, our attitudes die about 15 minutes after we die. Okay, think about it. Words have power. They have the power to teach, the power to wound, the power to shape the way people think, feel, and act towards each other. Definitely. Otto Wall, professor, University of Hartford, who specializes in studying words. Words are important. If you want to care for something, you call it a flower. If you want to kill something, you call it a weed. Don Coyhis, alcohol and drug counselor out in the Midwest, really powerful. A quick quote here, a quick story. I went to an emergency room one time, and the lady came back after checking my record and barely talking to me. She said, well, there's nothing we can do here. We can't help you here. And she didn't even get to talk to me. She was only going by my records. An individual with a history of substance use disorder discusses an experience of stigma in a healthcare setting. This is back in 2017. I just want to add that this vignette is not that uncommon, unfortunately. Unfortunately, the stigma is alive and well. And it kind of takes me back to, again, one of Father Martin's films back in, I don't know, Chalk Talk or Guidelines, either way, where there was the emergency room nurse, I'll paraphrase, the emergency room nurse treating individuals coming through the emergency room who had some kind of alcohol issue going on, and treating that individual with contempt, with disdain for them, because that nurse had a father who was a person with an alcohol problem for many years and never got into treatment. And that nurse never was able to, unfortunately, was able to work through those issues of having lived that kind of life with her father. And sometimes it happens that way, and it's sad, but it's real. This was done by a client. This isn't my work, but it was done by a client. And I think it says the message is clear. And you see the weight of the world, the stigma world, the person carrying the stigma on their back, okay? And they're stuck with it in the grief of their addiction. Okay, another picture here, alcoholism, you can beat it. Why are we showing a picture of a stamp? Okay, well, actually the idea was to try and stamp out alcoholism. This goes back to 1981. Okay, well, they were a lot cheaper then, that was for sure. And back in 81, okay, the American Medical Association saw, really, you got to give them credit because they wanted to let the country know that alcoholism was a treatable illness, okay? It was treatable. And things are happening. The field of alcoholism rehabilitation was getting off the ground then. It was really the Betty Ford Clinic. I think it might have opened for alcoholism, opened in, I think, 80 or 81. So there was a movement afoot. So the United States Post Office also combined with the American Medical Association to put this stamp out. Unfortunately, it backfired. And the reason it backfired was the recipient of a letter, okay, with the stamp on the envelope, felt that they were being stigmatized, that they were being targeted, that there was a message from the sender that might be suggesting you need a help with your alcohol problem, okay? So consequently, this stamp was the least amount of stamps ever issued by the post office. This stamp was, and consequently, they stopped publishing it. But you got to give credit to the field. You got to give credit to the field for trying to, again, to destigmatize alcoholism. All right, language of addiction. And here's where a lot of this has come from over the past 5 years. Michael Botticelli, former director, Office of National Drug Control Policy, okay, and his quote, "These are issues and these are words that have a dramatic impact on both clinical care and about how medical professionals actually see and treat people with addiction." Michael Botticelli in the early 2017 time period, he and his staff took a look at the language that we use, the terms, and said, we have to do something about this. This language is not the best, and we have to make language of recovery less stigmatizing. And we're going to jump into that soon. Stigma in words. Language frames what the people think, what the public thinks about substance use and recovery, and it can affect how individuals think about themselves and their own ability to change. But most importantly, language intentionally and unintentionally propagates stigma. So it's recommended to use language that promotes respect and dignity of all persons. Some examples of stigma. Well, defining people by the disorder, definitely. Hurtful words and comments, even though they might be inadvertent, they still hurt just as much. And I happened to work in treatment a long time ago, and let me tell you, clients, boy, they know if you have an attitude of any kind, they could feel it, they could sense it, they can almost smell it. And even though you might think they're not sensing some of a person's attitude, a therapist's attitude, don't be mistaken. Sensationalizing addiction and generalizing addiction. Well, when we look at the tabloids and we see what they show, okay, Amy Winehouse and Ben Affleck and Whitney Houston, again, a way of sensationalizing addiction, okay? And generalizing addiction, oh my goodness, is there something out there that addiction can't be attached to? Of course, we're in the football season now, so I put that fantasy football and the football addict up, but there's almost an addiction for anything. It almost seems that way. But by generalizing it, we're missing out on the real meaning of addiction. Addiction, mental health, stigma, and language. It's what we say, and it's how we say it. So I want to just take a few minutes here, and Colleen, if we could have if people would enter into the chat box, maybe some of the terms that they've heard in the field that are still out there in terms of stigmatizing words or terms, and anybody would like to volunteer to do that, that would be helpful. Or even a show of hands too, if you like to talk, that's fine too.
Hi, George. This is Rachel. I work with Colleen. I know she's on the phone trying to help somebody get into here. So I'm going to read through the list for you. The words,
Thanks, Rachel.
yeah, no problem. The words that are coming in are junkie, lush, druggy, resistant, elky, problematic, degenerate, non-compliant, resistant, loser, you're a bum, dirty, problem gambling, fall down drunk, drunken slob, drug seeking, crackhead, borderline.
Terrific, Rachel. Thank you all for sharing those terms. And those terms, as we know, they're real, they're still used, and that's the purpose of our presentation today, looking at the words and seeing how other words could be used and trying to dismantle stigma. I appreciate everyone's input on this. Let me go over, because some of these words are going to overlap from what I just heard. Yes, they do. They do. In the gambling field, the gambling disorder field, degenerate gambler, again, I think that term came from, might even come from before, 1974 movie, The Gambler. James Caan, I think, starred in it. And if you haven't seen that movie, I tell you, that's a good movie. That's a good movie. It really says a lot. And I think the term degenerate gambler was used at least a half dozen times in that film, but we still hear that. And you know what I'd like to know too? If people would be able to, into the chat box, just put what they think a degenerate gambler is, or what that term means to them. That would help me understand the perception of that term, because it varies. It varies, and I'd like to know what some of you think about it. Chisler, what's a Chisler? In case you're interested, Chisler's it's a gambler who, well, obviously he loves gambling, he loves booze, and he loves women, and that's a pretty deadly combination, I think. But that's who a Chisler is. And a whale's a high roller. A whale is somebody who really spends a lot of money. Casinos is given very preferential treatment. And then the rest of the terms that we know of and hear, unfortunately, still here to this day. Okay, so again, thank you, Rachel, jumping in and sharing those terms, and everyone who participated. So what are some examples of stigmatizing action, okay, that's occurred? Back in '85, New Jersey Division of Mental Retardation, which it was called then, they changed their name to DDD, okay, Developmental Disabilities. And more recently, the name in New Jersey drug courts, which was there since, oh my goodness, drug courts in New Jersey, early 90s, they changed their name to recovery courts just earlier this year. Very empowering, recovery courts versus drug courts, and much less stigmatizing. With both cancer and HIV, when stigma was reduced, lives were saved. And the same can be true of addiction. All right, really good, really Shatterproof org. You might be familiar with them. The nationwide private nonprofit advocacy in terms of doing, prevention work, and also trying to help eradicate stigma. So, what could we do about this? What could we all do? Well, we become a part of the solution. Okay, we become a student of stigma. We learn more about stigma. And I often, when I do talks, I often like to know from the audience, how many people have had a training, even a webinar like this on stigma? And if you have, kindly indicate that in the chat box. I always like to kind of take a count, just a quick count, because most of the time when I do a talk on stigma, most of the time people haven't had any training, not even a webinar. And I think that says something about the field, but we're making improvements. I have to say that there's much more interest now in this area than ever before. Watch our language. Wow, definitely. We can take a stand against stigma by changing the way we think about, talk about, and treat people with addiction disorders and or mental illness. Stigma's greatest enemy is knowledge. And addiction is not a moral failing. A direct quote from former Governor Chris Christie in New Jersey back in 2017. Watch your language. Don't define people by their disorder. Addiction and mental health disorders do not describe what a person is. It describes what a person has. Don't sensationalize addiction, as we saw on the screens before. Sensationalizing terms only diminish the fact that addiction is a treatable disease. Dr. Rena Nora, I have her picture up here, and I'll tell you why. Not only was she the first certified gambling counselor in New Jersey, she did a tremendous amount of work in the field of gambling disorder, tremendous. I believe it was 25 years, hands-on experience, MD psychiatrist she was. She passed in 08, I believe. Tremendous amount of work with families and problem gamblers. And she often would preface her talks before an audience of professionals. She'd often say, ask, who were people before they came to the doors of our treatment center? Who were they? Okay, and that kind of sometimes puzzled people, but that question, but before they became a person with an addiction problem, they were people. They were people before they became anyone suffering from a type of disorder. And Dr. Nora's motto was, treat people as people. That's timeless in my mind. Treat people as people. And this screen goes along with Dr. Nora's motto, I am a person first. Person first. And we need always to be mindful of that with individuals coming to get help, who might call in to the helpline, or a loved one, or a family member. I am a person first. All right, so again, back to watch your language, person first. Okay, stigmatizing language, problem gambler, compulsive gambler, disordered gambler. Dr. Lori Rugal opened up my eyes that these are not the best terms to be using. Even though they're widely used, they're not the best because they're stigmatizing. But a non-stigmatizing way of saying this would be a person experiencing gambling problems, a person with an addiction, a person with an alcohol problem, and so forth. Makes a huge difference, huge. Again, watch your language. Don't generalize about people with addictions. There's no addictive personality common to individuals with addiction. And I know that statement there is somewhat debatable, but I'll tell you, George Valiant, Dr. George Valiant, a psychiatrist who worked in the field, he writes a lot about, that there is no addictive personality. Sometime if you ever have a chance to look at his work, you'd find it pretty fascinating, I think. Don't use substance-related terms as metaphors. Don't say addicted to power, how to relapse with chocolate, because these terms diminish the meaning of substance-related terms and the reality of addiction-related experiences. Some more on watch your language. Avoid statements such as come back when you're ready, or I'm not going to work harder on your recovery than you are. I tell you, when I worked in treatment, I heard those terms, those sayings a few more times than I kind of care to say. And hopefully they're not being used as they were back in my time. Don't allow clients to diminish themselves. For example, have you ever heard of people in treatment, especially residential settings, refer to themselves as convicts or inmates? Well, I have. When I was a monitor for the state of New Jersey, and I would go to treatment programs, especially the inpatient ones, that term, again, was used more often than one would think. Labels are more frequently used than GA, AA, and NA. And of course, I can't forget Gamanon, and Al-Anon, and Naranon in those recovery meetings than at meetings such as Smart Recovery and Celebrate Recovery meetings. But I must say, there's a movement in the self-help fellowships that I just mentioned. There's a movement where less stigmatizing language is being used, and that's just so good to hear. Try to give clients the option of attending other meetings when appropriate and possible. Well, that's always good if you can, and sometimes you realize you can't, but sometimes it's, if it's possible, by all means. So we want to learn more about, we want to get more information. There's certainly tons of information out there on addictions and mental health disorders, and we want to speak out because there's a lot of misinformation, prejudice, and adverse effects of stigma. So when we can, to speak out, challenge inaccuracies, educate and elevate others. Definitely. Work with your staff on stigmatizing language, and we'll get to that in a few screens. Keep hope alive. Experiences show people with addiction disorders and or severe mental illness can live happy, healthy, fruitful years, most definitely. And we've seen individuals like that, I'm sure. Treat people with any type of disorder as people. Okay, so Rachel or Colleen, any questions, comments, anything noteworthy that you see in the chat box? Anyone?
Lots of comments in the chat. A lot of people just talking about how this is a good presentation about language and what they'll be using going forward. But yeah, and I just wanted to let you know we have just under 15 minutes left.
Okay, thanks for the heads up there. Appreciate it, and the comments from everyone. Okay, this is not my chart. This is not, this comes from the Addiction Technology Transfer Center Network. Real good website. If you haven't been there, you might want to try and go there. They have so much on language of recovery and so much on stigma. So, you know, here it will show, and I won't go through each of these with time constraints, but you'll see current, alternative, and the reasoning for that. I'll just take the last one on this by way of example. Jennifer's in denial, and my goodness, the denial term is, we know it's widely used. And again, the reasoning here is the alternative language would be Jennifer's ambivalent about whatever the issue would be. Jennifer hasn't internalized the seriousness of, and Jennifer doesn't understand. Okay, and the difference there is the reasoning is remove the blame and the stigma from the statement. Okay, really important in terms of taking away the stigma as best we can, and the blame too, because it's so easy to say, oh, well, you're not in denial, or I'm sorry, you are in denial. You don't get it. Get out of your denial. You know, how's the client hearing that? How's the client, what does that mean to the client? And instead of understanding it and presenting it in a different way, as this document suggests, you know, it often makes a big difference. And again, another chart here of language of recovery and the current terminology. We'll take a look at, we just did a denial. Let's take a look at relapse. Okay, and again, relapse commonly used, and substituting that with recurrence or return to use. See, because the reasoning for that is relapse really, if you take a look at that word, it goes back to the 1930s when prohibition was in place and all. Relapse really implies failure. Failure on the part of a person. Okay, yeah, you went and relapsed again. Okay, but recurrence and return to use, again, more strength-based, less stigmatizing. Okay, and then we look at self-help group, even that, mutual aid group, again, and the others. I don't have to go through them, but I'm sure you see the difference in terms of the terms and the reasoning and the importance of looking at the alternative terminology that's in the field right now. Okay, here we have 6 helpline numbers across the country. And New York's to the left at the top and New Jersey's to the right. And then we have, I won't name them all, but down at the bottom, we have the national councils. And in my presentations, I often ask, which ones do you feel might be less stigmatizing for a person calling in? Which one might you call into? Just say if you had an issue, or you wanted to just talk to somebody, or you know somebody that maybe you could try and help by calling this number. Which one might be less stigmatizing? Which ones? And I just like to, you know, take a quick is a poll on that. If if you can enter that into the chat box, that would be good. Because there are mixed feelings on this. There are mixed feelings as to, which number is more inviting, which is more strength-based, and which a person will be able to call and not feel stigmatized or judged. Okay, and then I'll come back to those, Colleen, if we have a chance, and before we close out. All right, stigma strategies. So let's get with, I'm looking at the clock. We have at least 5 more minutes before I want to open it up, questions and answers. Recovery needs to come out of the basement. We need a new language, a logo, T-shirts, a theme song, websites, TV ads, posters and buses, sobriety bars, sober sporting events, a sobriety lobby, a recovery caucus, celebrity spokespersons, and corporate sponsors. We need public relations attraction, not invisibility. Okay, Rob Fleming, his program Recovery Works, really good stuff. Okay, check your program out, check yourself. Is it recovery oriented? Had a program in New Jersey years ago, it's called Lost Souls. Not a good name for a program. In fact, they had to close, they didn't have many clients, and research has shown the more strength-based and empowering and less stigmatizing name you have for your program, the more clients will appear for help. Is your staff trained in destigmatizing language? I asked that question earlier. If not, please try and avail yourselves of that kind of training. Is your community, is your program open, or have family nights for those not in therapy? What are your personal beliefs about people becoming addicted? Okay, do you accept certain types of addictions more than others? All thoughts, do a gut check, okay? Because really important in terms of how you're approaching clients, in terms of your own internal beliefs. Do you believe some people are beyond help? Do you believe certain drug treatment approaches are better than others? Do you believe that recovery must look a certain way? Okay, and if we're in recovery ourselves, do we think the clients have to do it kind of like our way? Or do we understand there are multiple pathways to recovery? Do you believe the words you use support addiction and mental health disorders are conditions from which people can experience recovery? Okay, I'm on the fast track right now. Demystify treatment. Don't focus on adverse consequences. We know the doom and gloom of the consequences in our field. Try and look at the positive. Explain the phases, stages, goals, and objectives of treatment. Take the mystique out of recovery, okay? It's a dynamic, multi-phase process. Improvements are often incremental. Humanize recovery. Have people in recovery tell their stories. Let people know treatment works. Okay, so as we getting close to the finish line, okay, oftentimes problem gamblers are seen by society as weak-willed, immoral, corrupt, selfish individuals. So here's our challenge, all right? And we've heard, why can't they just stop? It's the gambler's own fault. We've heard that too many times. But stigma is not alleviated solely by educating people on the science of a disease. Partly, and this is the important part, it requires facilitating contact between a stigmatized group and a wider community. And that's why I said in that early screen, footnote this one, because it's important, and I'm going to bring it together now. Empathy and compassion can then begin to replace judgment and fear. Dr. Volko heads up the executive director of National Institute on Drug Abuse. Okay, a poster back in the late 70s, early 80s, it was one of my favorite. It says it all. There's no such thing as typical. We have all kinds, 9 million alcoholic Americans. It's our #1 drug problem. How destigmatizing a poster can you have? That was a beaut. Let me tell you, that said it all. I often talk to Keith White at the National Council about, we need a poster like this for the typical problem gambler in our country. Sometime I'm going to, hopefully something will happen. And footnote, there's now approximately 15 million Americans with alcohol problems. Magic Johnson. Why is Magic up there? Well, I'll tell you why. Maybe one of the greatest players that ever played professional basketball, as you know. Magic in 1991 announced that he retired from the NBA, the National Basketball Association. He retired then because he had contracted HIV, okay? And when Magic came out, it was interesting when he shared that with the world. It was a case that up until that time, let me tell you, the public health field, the medical field, I tell you, HIV patients were not really given, I think it's safe to say, were not really given the best of care, unfortunately. Unfortunately, they were stigmatized. They were excluded in many ways. And in many respects, by Magic announcing he had HIV, it was one of the messages in there was that I read, anyone can contract HIV, not just a certain population, anyone. And consequently, after that, HIV/AIDS patients and individuals were seen in a different light and were given better medical care, fortunately. So I'm just bouncing back to the previous screen where I said that next to the last bullet, partly it requires facilitating contact between a stigmatized group, as the HIV/AIDS group was back in the day, and the wider community. Magic didn't know all the good he did by announcing, okay, what had happened to him, but he sure helped many, many individuals suffering from HIV/AIDS, and also helped society realize HIV/AIDS does not discriminate either. Celebrate recovery, support and encourage people in recovery. Share positive stories of recovery. Wow, they're so good. Lived experience. Speak out against stigma. Definitely. Learn more about gambling disorder. See the person, not the condition. Take action. Okay, wrapping up. I see we have less than 5 minutes. Oh my goodness, I didn't mean to run us. Here's my email and contact information. Please feel free. Any thoughts on today? Anything you'd like to contact me with in the future? By all means, reach out to me. I'm available.